Hello, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, I'm Dr. Shivika Sethi. I'm a national level faculty of microbiology and the author of the book Mastering Microbiology for all PG entrants and academics. Today I'm going to be discussing microbiology multiple choice questions based on the pattern of the NEET PG entrance exam held in 2020. Now before I start the questions, let me remind you not to forget to subscribe to my channel PGMEE Microbiology Prep for notifications whenever I upload a new video to help you out. For any queries or doubts, you can send me an email. My email address is micro.queries@yahoo.com. For academic discussions, you can join my Facebook group, Microbiology Prep by Dr. Shivika. And for comprehensive videos on medical microbiology for university exams as well as for PG entrance exams, you can subscribe to the Marrow app. So let's start with the questions. A female from a tribal area of Jharkhand reports with fever, chills and malaise for the last 2 to 3 days. Peripheral blood is collected and stained with Giemsa. A diagnosis of malaria is made. The smear is shown in the figure. What is the likely cause? Falciparum, Plasmodium vivax, malariae or ovale. Now look at this figure out here. What is it showing? First, whenever you get a question on diagnosis of which species of Plasmodium is causing malaria, look for the size. Look at the size of the RBCs, whether they are enlarged. The parasitized RBCs are not enlarged, as you can see, by comparison with the non-parasitized ones. So this immediately rules out Plasmodium vivax and ovale. And then you can see multiple rings, right? So that means since one single RBC is containing multiple ring forms, that means our diagnosis is Plasmodium falciparum. Okay, now let's quickly review the blood picture of a patient with Plasmodium falciparum malaria. So this you can see sometimes the parasite is attached just to the RBC surface membrane. These are called as marginal forms or also called as acole forms or also called as applique forms. Acole or applique forms, right? Then you can see multiple rings. Sometimes you can also appreciate multiple chromatin dots, which is called as head-phone appearance. Then we can see the young trophozoite, the late trophozoite. Then you can see the schizont, early schizont, late schizont stage. Then we can see the banana or the crescent-shaped gametocytes. Okay. Moving on to our next question. This is an image-based question again. Shown in the figure is the HBV card test. Which of the following is the principle of this test? Okay, so you can see the HBs antigen detection test is being shown, right? And the answer to this question is immunochromatographic. These are all called as immunochromatographic tests, also called as lateral flow assays, right? So that's the answer to our question. If you ever get such an image, this can be used not just for detection of HBs antigen in the patient's serum, can be used for detection of several antigens like Salmonella typhi antigens in the serum of the patient. Now this is a view of the working of the lateral flow assays. This is a nitrocellulose membrane, right? And now there's a sample pad on which we are going to add the patient's specimen, right? So here we are detecting the HBs antigen. So we are going to drop the patient's serum specimen on the sample pad. Just beyond the sample pad, we have a conjugate pad which is containing antibody against the HBs antigen, and that is labeled antibody. Generally it is colloidal gold labeled antibody. Further along, now when this antigen migrates by lateral flow, it binds to this antibody. Then both this antigen antibody complex, then they further migrate along this membrane. Here we have on the first band, we have the primary antibody. This antibody is again directed to the same HBs antigen. And further along, we have a band on which antibody against this labeled antibody is impregnated. Now this antibody is basically deposited along this band for the validity of the test. Okay, so this band has to come positive to say the test is valid. So when this antigen antibody complex migrates, when the antigen binds out here, as you can see here in this is going to show up as a colored band. And further along, when this antibody further migrates along, the unbound antibody, it binds to this secondary antibody, and this is going to show up as the control line, right, for the validity of the test. Similar tests are the malaria rapid diagnostic tests. A previously healthy 11-year-old girl develops a GI infection with cramping and watery stools, right? So this is a diarrhea. After several days, she begins to pass blood per rectum. So this becomes a bloody diarrhea, and she is hospitalized for dehydration. In the hospital, it is noted that she is having decreasing urine output with rising blood urea nitrogen. Total blood count reveals anemia along with thrombocytopenia. So what is the hint you're getting? That this is probably a bloody diarrhea associated with renal failure, with anemia, with thrombocytopenia. The peripheral blood smear is remarkable for fragmented RBCs. So these are the schistocytes. So this is suggestive of microangiopathic hemolytic anemia. Infection with EHEC is suspected. Which of the following can be used for identification of a specific strain of the suspected organism, right? So basically we are being asked the medium. Deoxycholate citrate agar, bile salt agar, sorbitol McConkey, and McConkey agar. Now, a very important strain of enterohemorrhagic Escherichia coli is E. coli O157H7. Right, so basically we are being asked which is the medium for identification of this bacterium, and the answer to this question is sorbitol McConkey agar. Now let us see the working of a sorbitol McConkey agar. Generally all of us know that McConkey medium contains the sugar lactose, but instead of lactose we have added sorbitol in this medium. Right, now all E. coli, in fact all E. coli, all Escherichia coli, they ferment sorbitol. They are sorbitol fermentation positive. But O157H7, that is an exception. It does not ferment sorbitol, non-sorbitol fermenting. Right, so on this medium, when we isolate O157H7, it produces these pale colored colonies. You can see the other sorbitol fermenting colonies. These would be the other E. coli, but O157H7 does not ferment sorbitol, and hence we can easily identify it on this medium. Right, so let's go through some important point about enterohemorrhagic Escherichia coli. It's a zoonotic infection. Why? Because it is a normal flora in the GI tract of cows, right? So cows are the reservoir for enterohemorrhagic. It has a very small infective dose. 10 to 100 bacteria can cause the disease. So what is this going to help us remember? That this disease can be easily transmitted via contaminated fomites like bathroom towels, handles, etc., and can also be transmitted from person to person via contaminated fingers. Then EHEC, they have the locus of enterocyte effacement plasmid, just like enteropathogenic E. coli. So they are going to produce the attachment effacement effect on the enterocytes. Plus, they also produce the verocytotoxin or the Shiga-like toxin, which acts by inhibiting protein synthesis. And the most dangerous serotype of enterohemorrhagic E. coli is O157H7, often complicated by hemolytic uremic syndrome. That was the history that was mentioned in the question of HUS being complicating this disease. A child develops septic shock following meningitis On examination, the child has a petechial rash as shown in the figure. So we got again an image-based question. Which of the following is a gram-negative diplococcus that can be the likely etiology? So very easy, gram-negative diplococcus. Amongst these, which is the gram-negative diplococcus? Neisseria meningitidis, right? Pseudomonas aeruginosa would be ruled out because it is a gram-negative rod. Streptococcus pneumoniae is a gram-positive diplococcus, and E. coli are also gram-negative rods. A very important thing to remember about meningococcal meningitis is when it gets complicated to septicemia, it is associated with a characteristic petechial or a purpuric rash. Right, that's the typical morphology of meningococcus. They are appearing as gram-negative diplococci, and they have a half moon shaped or a lens shaped morphology. Which of the following is the vector for Zika virus? Answer to this question will be Aedes aegypti. Aedes is the vector for Zika. Now let's quickly go through the chronological history of Zika virus. Sometimes it is mentioned in the questions. Zika virus belongs to the family Flaviviridae. Flaviviridae, these are single-stranded RNA viruses which are enveloped. They have an icosahedral capsid. There are many members viruses belonging to this family. But the important genera which cause disease in humans belong to either Flavi or Hepacy virus. So all arthropod-borne viruses amongst the Flavi are belonging to the genus Flavivirus, and hepatitis C is the only one which is not arthropod borne, right? This belongs to the genus Hepacy virus, right? So coming to the chronology of Zika. Zika was first reported, or it was first isolated from a rhesus monkey in 1947 in the Zika forest of Uganda. Right? But it was first reported to cause infections in humans when there was a survey carried out for a jaundice causing infection in Africa at that time, and it was found that 6% of humans were seropositive for antibodies against Zika. Subsequent serological surveys, when they were carried out, it was found that several Asian and African countries had seropositive individuals. So it was widespread in humans. But till the year 2007, there were only 13 confirmed symptomatic human cases of Zika virus in Southeast Asia and Africa. From 2007, it was found that there were several small outbreaks of Zika virus from the Pacific Islands, but it came to world attention in the year 2015 when Olympics were supposed to be hosted in Brazil. It was just around that time reported in Brazil in the year 2015 as a large outbreak of rash illness. In the same year, in July, in Brazil, it was reported to be associated with Guillain-Barré syndrome, and also the same year it was reported to be associated with microcephaly, transplacental transfer leading to microcephaly in the fetus. Right, let's do some epidemiological points about Zika. The reservoir for Zika virus is monkeys, and the vector is Aedes aegypti mainly, but other Aedes species also can transmit Zika. Apart from being arthropod borne, it is also transmitted across the placenta, also transmitted sexually, as well as via blood and blood product transfusions, as well as organ transplantation. So all these are modes of transmission of Zika virus, not just arthropod, transplacental, sexual, blood transfusions, as well as organ transplantation. Zika virus disease has an incubation period of 3 to 14 days, and most infections are asymptomatic, right? And when the patient is symptomatic, what are the manifestations? The patient has fever with arthralgias, with myalgias, a maculopapular rash, headache, and conjunctivitis. Some people get complicated with Guillain-Barré syndrome, And as I said earlier, transplacental transmission sometimes in about 5 to 15% of patients leads to congenital Zika syndrome. Now, before we discuss congenital Zika syndrome manifestations, also remember that transplacental transmission can also lead to fetal loss, stillbirths, and preterm births. Now, what are the manifestations of congenital Zika syndrome? Most important, microcephaly. Then the child has seen as defects, hypertonia, limb contractures, deafness, as well as eye defects like pigmentary retinopathy. Now, apart from congenital Zika syndrome, which are the other infections which are associated with microcephaly, these include cytomegalovirus, congenital cytomegalovirus infection, congenital varicella syndrome, congenital rubella syndrome, Zika, as well as toxoplasma. So we have 4 viral diseases leading to microcephaly and 1 toxoplasmosis. A 12-year-old boy presents with vomiting within 3 hours of consumption of food at a party. So this is within 3 hours of consumption of the food. What is the likely causative organism responsible for these symptoms? So Staphylococcus aureus, Salmonella, Clostridium botulinum, Clostridium perfringens. So this is vomiting within 3 hours of consumption of food. So answer is Staphylococcus aureus, food poisoning. That's a short incubation food poisoning, less than 6 hours is the incubation period. Another cause of short incubation food poisoning is Bacillus cereus. Now remember about staphylococcal food poisoning, the toxin is a heat stable toxin which can survive 100 degrees Celsius for 10 to 40 minutes. It's a preformed toxin. So despite heating the food, the toxin survives in the implicated food. And what is the enterotoxin? What is its mechanism of action? It acts by stimulation of the vagus and the vomiting center. A 5-year-old boy presents with sore throat for the last 2 days. On examination, he has a grayish-white pseudomembrane around his tonsils. So again, an image-based question. Diphtheria is suspected. What prophylactic steps should be taken for a child or for the younger sibling who is 3 years old and has received immunization as per the immunization schedule, right? So this is a 5-year-old patient, suspected diphtheria, and what we are being asked about, post-exposure prophylactic step for his sibling who is 3 years old, right? Now this child has received the complete immunization schedule. So answer to this question will be prophylaxis with oral erythromycin. That's the only post-exposure prophylaxis that we will give to this 3-year-old sibling. Now let's quickly go through the immunization schedule for diphtheria. Normal immunization schedule for diphtheria is we give primary, the first dose is given around 2 months. 4 weeks later, we give the secondary dose. Again, 4 weeks later, we give the third dose, and the fourth dose is given around 15 to 18 months. So at least a minimum of 6 months after the third dose, right? And as we all know, what is the vaccine we are giving for diphtheria? It is combined. So diphtheria toxoid combined with the tetanus toxoid and acellular pertussis vaccine, right? So this is how we give. Coming to the boosters, then we give a booster at between 4 to 6 years of age. So just around the school going age, around 5 years or so, we give a booster dose. Then it is recommended that we give another booster at around 11 to 12 years of age. Now notice, up till now we had been giving the big D, that is containing about 15 to 25 flocculating units of diphtheria toxoid. 15 to 25 flocculating units of diphtheria toxoid is in the big D. But for children 7 years of age and above, we give the small d. right? So this is just containing about 1.5 flocculating units of the diphtheria toxoid. And finally, it is recommended that every 10 years later, we should give another booster of diphtheria toxoid, right? So these are the boosters. Now, this fifth dose is not needed in case we are given the fourth dose not at 15 to 18 months, but we have given it just around the 4 years of age. Okay. So the fifth dose is not required if the fourth dose was given on or after the fourth birthday. Okay. And also remember, if there is any interruption of the recommended schedule or any delay in the subsequent doses, it does not reduce the response for the vaccine. So we don't need to, restart the schedule. So just give it as usual if you've delayed the vaccine doses. Now, coming to children who are unvaccinated or people who are unvaccinated 7 years or older. What will be the schedule? So the patient has not been vaccinated earlier. So we will give 3 doses now, a primary dose and immediately. A second dose will be given 4 weeks later, and the third diphtheria dose toxoid dose will be given at 6 to 12 months, right? So for these people, we will give only 3 doses. And at least one of these doses should be the TDAP. So it should be TDAP, not just TD. So one of these 3 doses should be TDAP. Now coming to the vaccination. Now once we know, as was in this patient, vaccination does not prevent infection or transmission. So the patient gets infected, it becomes an asymptomatic carrier and can transmit the infection to others. So all close contacts of a case of diphtheria, first of all, we should immediately do a culture from their throat and the nose. And after we've taken the nasal swabs and the throat swabs, they should receive prophylaxis. And what prophylaxis should we give? So the patient may be completely vaccinated, yet we will give antibiotic prophylaxis. Now let's see what are we going to do. If we come to know that the most recent vaccine dose has been given 5 years back, within the last 5 years, then we will only give antibiotic prophylaxis in the form of either a single dose of intramuscular benzathine penicillin or erythromycin for oral erythromycin for 7 to 10 days. That was the answer to our question. In this, the child was 3 years of age and had been vaccinated within the last 5 years. If the child or the individual, the contact had received the recent vaccine dose with more than 5 years back, along with the antibiotic, we will give 1 booster vaccine dose, right? But if the vaccination history is unknown or incomplete, along with the antibiotic prophylaxis, we will immediately give a diphtheria vaccine, and we should complete the vaccine schedule according to the age, as I already talked about, right? So the answer to the question was erythromycin prophylaxis. Which of the following is the cause of donovanosis? Haemophilus ducreyi, Klebsiella granulomatis, Leishmania donovani, and Treponema pallidum. Now this is a trick question. Thinking of donovanosis, we would have a tendency to mark Leishmania donovani, but Leishmania donovani, that causes visceral leishmaniasis. Donovanosis is caused by Klebsiella granulomatis, right? Now, donovanosis is one of the causes of the painless genital ulcers. As we know, there are mainly 5 causes of genital ulcers. 3 of them are painless, like syphilis, lymphogranuloma venereum, and donovanosis, also called as granuloma inguinale. And there are 2 causes of painful genital ulcers, which are soft sore or chancroid and genital herpes, right? So donovanosis or granuloma inguinale is caused by Klebsiella granulomatis. It was earlier called as Calymetobacterium granulomatis. It's a painless, slowly progressive genital ulcer. And when we prepare a smear or take a biopsy and stain it with either Giemsa stain or Wright stain, what we see are pleomorphic bacilli inside macrophages or neutrophils, which are called as Donovan bodies. Now, Klebsiella granulomatis is very difficult to culture. So generally we either use a Giemsa stain or we use a molecular method to detect the genes for the organism. Drug of choice is azithromycin. Apart from azithro, alternative drugs are ciproflox or doxycycline. Disinfectant property of household bleach is due to hypochlorous acid, hypochlorite, chlorine, and hydrogen ions. And the answer to this question is hypochlorous acid. Now this is a slightly controversial question because some books do mention that chlorine, the free chlorine, is responsible for the disinfectant property of household bleach. Household bleach is sodium hypochlorite, right? But this answer is from the CDC side that chlorine, free chlorine then breaks down into hypochlorous acid, and the main disinfecting property is in the hypochlorous acid. Now, household bleach is basically 5 to 6% solution of sodium hypochlorite in water. It is used in two concentrations, or rather two dilutions. 1:10 household bleach is used to disinfect excreta, bodies, as well as spills. Very important to remember, infectious spills. These are disinfected by sodium hypochlorite in a dilution of 1:10 in water. And 1:100 bleach solution is used to disinfect surfaces, medical equipment, as well as reusable protective clothing before they are laundered, right? So personal protective equipment, gowns, etc. should be disinfected in 1:100 bleach dilution before it is laundered. Which of the following is most likely to be acquired by traumatic inoculation? Blastomyces dermatitis, Sporothrix schenki, Coccidioides immitis, and Paracoccidioides brasiliensis. Now all these are dimorphic fungi, but the option A, C, and D, all these are primarily acquired by inhalation of spores, whereas Sporothrix schenki is mainly acquired by traumatic implantation. Right, so that's our answer. Now, Sporothrix schenki causes sporotrichosis, which is also called as Rose Gardner's disease. And following the traumatic implantation of this fungus into the skin and the subcutaneous tissues, these kinds of lesions form, which are classically described as nodulo-ulcerative lesions along lymphatics. So they are spreading proximally along lymphatics. Right, so this is my discussion of part 1 of the discussion of these questions. I've discussed 10 MCQs in this. I will be discussing the subsequent 11 questions in another video. Don't forget to watch that also. Thank you.